Today on Geekerati, we're going to discuss an article by Robin D. Laws called 4 Players and a Murder Hobo. It's an article about disruptive players, and it gives potential advice for how to deal with a player who distracts or detracts from a long-term campaign. It's an imperfect article from one of my favorite game designers, and I want to chat about the things that I like and don't like about the article. So join me for a discussion today about 4 Players and a Murder Hobo.
Hello and welcome to Geekerati.
4 geeks, by geeks, and with geeks.
Life below the earth.
Welcome to Overtime.
Brave enough to do battle with hideous monsters.
I am Sinistar.
Hello, and welcome to Geekerati. I'm Christian Lindke, I'm your host here, and if you like the content that I provide, please like and subscribe. I'm trying to build an audience and to build a community that discusses role-playing games, the history of role-playing games, and how to be a great game master. So let's engage in a discussion today about one of my favorite game designers and GM advice authors, Robin D. Laws. Now, for those of you who don't know, Robin D. Laws is one of the most thoughtful writers of game mastering advice in the entire tabletop gaming hobby. He's written extensively about how to run role-playing games in order to maximize the fun quotient for your group's players. His book, Robin's Laws of Good Game Mastering, sits on my DM prep shelf right next to Aaron Alston's Peerless Strike Force as one of my 2 go-to guides. I look to these guides whenever I'm facing any challenges in my game mastering because they very often offer a solution. While there are several other books on my bookshelf, in fact, technically it's several shelves, I'm constantly impressed by how often other volumes, newer volumes in particular, contain information that builds upon the ideas that was originally conveyed in these 2 books. To phrase things another way, Robin D. Laws has influenced the way I run games more than any other writer or game designer, other than Aaron Alston. It was this very admiration that led me to be surprised when I recently reread an article that he wrote for Pelgrane Press for their C-Page XX blog in 2016 that was entitled 4 Players and a Murder Hobo. My surprise was rooted in a quote from Robin's essay that struck me as particularly harsh. In fact, it was out of character from the advice that he had given in general. It's where he said, "There's a word for a player who consistently takes his fun at others' expense, even after you've pointed out that this is what he's doing. Goodbye." This angry response suggested to me that Robin must be thinking of a particular player or situation, and that this led Robin to give what I believe to be potentially bad advice. And this advice seemed to be more like an angry snap judgment at a particular situation or a particular player than a thoughtful essay. And Robin is typically known for his extraordinarily thoughtful essays. I was at minimum surprised at Robin's possible characterization of a gaming phenomenon that's occurred more than once at my gaming table, though more often at a convention or a one-shot game store than in my home games, at least recently. It's also a gaming phenomenon that Robin's past writing has helped me to overcome or to engage with more proactively and productively. At least, I thought that I'd gleaned how to deal with this productively from his writing and insight in the past. The conflict between my perception of a problem and how to engage with it and Robin's advice and anger in this particular essay prompted me to do this video and to write an essay about it for my Substack blog. Because I wanted to respond to an error that I believe Robin may be making in his analysis. In my assessment, he seems to be leaving a significant factor out of his analysis, but I'll get on more to that later. What is this problem, and what is Robin's advice? Robin begins his article in an engaging manner by providing 3 brief, sinister situations that might occur in play and disrupt an entire campaign, or at minimum, the adventure that you and the players have agreed to play. The first of these goes like this. "Okay, so now that the monks are locked inside the tower, I set fire to it. That'll teach them to look down their noses at me. Burn, monks, burn." The second is a little bit different, and it goes like this. "As soon as it's my turn to guard the prisoner, when I'm sure the others are all asleep, I stride over to him and slit his throat. And the last one, once again, a little bit different. I'm tired of taking guff from the Gnome King. I have my heat shield cloak on. So the confined space of this throne room? One word. Fireball. Now, I'm not going to spend any time evaluating the specifics of any one of these examples. The rabbit hole of that analysis would be unending. But I will say that each of these examples is reflective of a single player engaging in a style of play that's not collaborative with the other players. Robin calls it that classic moment of role-playing dysfunction when one person in the group decides that it's time to cross the line from lovable rogue to psychopathic scumbag. The key issue Robin is highlighting in this circumstance is that a player is asserting agency over the storyline and gameplay in a way that significantly affects the logical consistency of the narrative, and more importantly, forces the other players to suffer the consequences of this action without ever taking into account the real feelings of those players and the GM. Phrased this way, it's a significant problem on the part of the player. But before I move on to Robin's recommendations and my eventual response to them, it's important to note that this is only a problem when it's done in a disruptive way. And this is something that Robin concedes in the article. If all of the players expressed wishes to shift from consulting detectives to anarchist terrorists, well, this would only be a moment that the campaign shifted from heroic to villainous or vigilante-esque. It might not make much narrative sense from what people had intended at the beginning of the campaign, but it could be fun. On the other hand, if it's only one player who makes the shift and declares the action, then there's a potential issue here. It's what we in political science might call a collective action problem. How do you get a murder hobo to comply with the rest of the group's norms in order to promote an equitable distribution of a public good? In this case, the public good is the entertainment value of the campaign, and this can be threatened by an antagonistic actor, something that's more significant than a mere free rider problem in a gaming group. In society, free rider problems can be significant, but in a gaming group, free riders aren't necessarily a problem at all. They're the friend who comes to hang out and chill with their other friends. That can actually be a benefit. They may not contribute much to the campaign itself, but their company and presence provides comfort and good entertainment in the sense of being a good companion to the other players. So free riders, generally as players, separate from characters, don't tend to really be a problem in gameplay, but what often can be a problem is an antagonistic player. So how do you incentivize the player to participate in the norms that produce a particular good or outcome? What you want to do is make sure that you can do this even when that player seems dedicated to the pursuit of a different good or outcome. And this is a particular challenge. This is a problem to which Robin offers a couple of solutions. The first solution he offers is that he recommends breaking down the fourth wall and confronting the player via a couple of strategies. You can read his full article for the analysis on this, and I'll provide a link to that down in the description. But the short version of his advice is that Robin recommends confronting the player and letting the consequences of the action be known to all and every other player in the group, and that expulsion of the player from the group as a whole is a possible consequence. But I'd like to take a step back further to offer another alternative for Robin and other game masters to consider with regard to solutions, and maybe sources of the problem. It still likely involves breaking the fourth wall, but it shifts the focus of analysis away from merely the single deviant player and looks at a host of variables. If having fun during a role-playing game can be said to be a measurable dependent variable, and we'll get to that in a minute, the reason I want to focus on it this way and to look at things beyond the deviant individual player who is seeking to derail what is otherwise a good story is his particular examples made me think of a time when I was a younger gamer and I was playing in a Call of Cthulhu game at a convention in the Bay Area. And I remember I hadn't had a lot of experience playing Call of Cthulhu, and we're investigating some weird happenings. And my character is getting more and more scared. And in fact, I, at the time, 14-ish, I was getting more wrapped up in this scared narrative and really concentrating on that. And I ended up beginning to become a little bit paranoid about the way that the game master was portraying the people with which I was engaging, or my character was engaging. And this led my character to have one of these moments, leading to an entirely different adventure than the game master planned, as it became about me fleeing from the law and getting arrested. And this was a con game, or a convention game. And I'm not saying that I acted rationally, but I wasn't acting in a sinister way to derail things. The thing that mattered here was the way that the game master presented information to me. And we're going to get back to that. But before we get to that, I want to return to my discussion about variables and maybe having fun in a role-playing game as a dependent variable or a measurable thing. And I don't mean to descend too deeply into the world of felicific calculus, but let's imagine that we can call a variable of the overall fun that you have in a role-playing game RPG sub h. We love in political science to create variables with subnumbers. The h in this case stands for hedons. And that this feeling of enjoyment has several contributing variables, other factors, that include the rule set, the setting, the players, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Remember, it's 4 players and a murder hobo. The murder hobo themselves, who we'll call P murder hobo, and the GM. Robin's analysis, as I mentioned earlier, focuses solely on the player and GM variables, in this case all the players and the GM. And it seems, to me at least, that he's leaving out a couple of potential constructs. For example, he leaves out discussion of the rule set, and I think that's because he's trying to provide broad advice that applies no matter what game you're playing. But he also leaves out the GM with regards to the setting up of the situation and the creation of potentially resentment on the part of the player. While he technically leaves out a setting for the campaign, his discussion of verisimilitude includes an understanding of the importance of settings and how they interact with players. Robin here assumes that 4 of the non-murder hobo players have similar goals and a commitment to this variable, RPG H, and that the murder hobo no longer does. If I was to represent the pleasure arrived at this game in some kind of mathematical way, I might represent it like this. RPG sub h equals r plus s plus p1 plus p2 plus p3 plus p all the way to x, which is 4 in this case, plus murder hobo plus GM. At first glance, this reduction of gaming experience to hedonic mathematics is kind of ridiculous. I've presented an artificially reductive example that equates the amount of fun a gaming group is having to a baffling and almost incoherent equation. Just look at it. It's bizarre. Why am I doing this? Why am I turning the social aspect of gaming into an equation? It's one thing to do it with damage or to hit rolls, but the fun? Who do I think I am? Am I the Jeremy Bentham of RPG theory? No. I'm only doing this to highlight my point. And that point is that Robin's article has either assumed or stated outright that each of the variables above has been a positive contributor to the entertainment experiences of those involved, only with one exception. And that exception is the murder hobo. In Robin's argument, narrowly construed so that only one player wants to be the murder hobo. Otherwise, the murder hobo hedons, damn you, Jeremy Bentham, that would be the dependent variable, because they'd all have agreed with it. And Robin also assumes that the group desires play that incorporates fantasy with social constraint, whereas the murder hobo has advocated one without social constraints. Unstated, but also implied, is that the game master wants a play style that engages in fantasy with social constraint as well, otherwise there would be no need for intervention. But none of Robin's article touches on several questions that might be central in this discussion, because he leaves out analysis of the game master in his essay. Remember my story about my experience at DungeonCon, playing Call of Cthulhu. I was lost. I was looking to the GM to guide me, and the GM kept making and describing situations that made me, and it was really just me, more and more paranoid. And, well, my reaction ended up being pretty extreme. But so, too, did it seem that the game master was pushing me in a particular direction. So Robin's article leaving out the game master in this situation was surprising to me, particularly given the emphasis in Robin's Laws, his book, on the importance of the game master. Robin's Rule 0 is that role-playing games are entertainment. Your goal as GM is to make your games as entertaining as possible for all participants. Notice the focus here. The focus here is that role-playing games are a means by which game masters create entertainment for their players. Now, it doesn't mean that they're creating narrative. It doesn't mean that they are storytellers. It means that they're facilitators. They're facilitators of fun. They want it to be entertaining for all participants. Robin, while he allows for and in fact encourages player agency in all of his writings, highlights the importance of the GM as an arbiter to facilitate that, to ensure that other people have fun. So if the GM is so important, that leaves the following questions unanswered by Robin. First, how well did the game master understand the players in the group? Second, did the game master provoke the murder hobo into this action? And third, and I think this is also central, why is the murder hobo a part of the group in the first place? Given that each of the examples that Robin provides seems to include a disconnect between what the game master is offering the murder hobo player and what Robin Laws would determine or would term that player's emotional kick. And I'm not going to go too far down into the individual analysis of each one, but none of them, or maybe all of them, seem to be an example where the player may not have been provided their emotional kick earlier. Rather than this being primarily a player problem, I think it's possible that the game master did not understand the group sufficiently, and that this is in fact a game master problem. For example, let me just take a step back here. One might imagine that the murder hobo player is what Robin Laws calls in his book the butt kicker. If this is the case, did the game master understand this and incorporate sufficient mayhem to satisfy that player? Is there an imbalance in the group of method actors to butt kickers? If there is, it's incumbent upon the game master to acknowledge this and to set campaign norms that satisfy as many players as possible. And in fact, once again, going back to his advice, all of the players. Maybe the descent into maniacal mayhem was avoidable had the game master maintained sufficient attention to various players' emotional kicks, all of the players. Additionally, in any situation of a player acting out or acting so out of character, the game master must consider whether he or she is in fact the source of the problem. During a heavily role-playing oriented section, did the game master not so subtly over-snark the player's character in order to get the action back on target? I know I've been guilty of this from time to time, less now than when I was younger, but I'm human. And I've sometimes mildly antagonized people who annoyed me during and before play. This isn't common in my regular gaming group, but when I'm around people I don't know at a convention, if I see a player acting in a way that I don't particularly want facilitated at my table, in the past, as I say, much less so now that I'm older, but when I was younger, I might mildly antagonize them in hopes to coerce them to do different behavior without breaking the fourth wall. If it's due to game master antagonism or pressure, like the situation that I described before that I experienced as a player in a Call of Cthulhu game, then breaking the fourth wall in this case may require an apology on the part of the game master, because it is the game master who's actually the one reducing RPG sub H. Given how much work game mastering is, some players are willing to tolerate a lot of lapses into poor GMing in order to just get on with the gaming. While it may or may not be the case, a game master should always consider whether he or she contributed to the rebellion and what can be done about it. Don't always blame the player. First, look to see if you played any role in that behavior that is diverting play in a different direction. Lastly, the game master needs to ask why the murder hobo is gaming with the group in the first place. If it's because it's a convention game, then more abrupt tactics might be necessary to engage the player because of the need to ensure the other players are having a good time. If the person is a close personal friend, then there are other considerations. Partly this goes back to the answer to the first question, but it does add another layer. In this case, it isn't just whether the game master has a proper understanding of the player, it's also whether the player has a proper understanding of the group's norms. But it's incumbent upon a game master to convey to new players the group's norms before play even begins. In fact, that's what I use my Session Zeros for. My Session Zeros aren't about creating characters and backstories. They're about getting to know one another and the expectations that we have in play. Is your group or is your game going to be more role-playing heavy? Is it more combat heavy? How much player agency is there to affect the world? Not just player agency in individual actions, but do they want to have some grand scope or grand ability to affect the entire campaign world? How realistic are the settings that the group prefers? Do they want a down-to-earth setting with low magic? Do they want a high magic setting? Do they want consequences for actions like the ones described before, or do they want hand-wavium to make it so that when they act rashly, nothing happens? These are all things that a game master should be trying to inform all players of from the beginning and to find out from those players. One cannot assume norms across the hobby. In fact, as a part of my research for not this article, but for other articles I'll be doing on gaming history and the types of role-playing gamer there are, I read issues of Different Worlds magazine and Alarms and Excursions, the fanzine. And in the Alarms and Excursion fanzine issues, I was quickly disabused of any notion at all that gamers in any broad way played anything that I would have recognized as fun. A lot of the players in Alarms and Excursions were playing games I would never want to be a part of, but they were having a great time, and their group was enjoying themselves. I wouldn't have recognized it as fun, but they do. And I think it's important in our discussions of gaming and styles of gaming that we understand that different players in different groups have different styles of play, and that it's okay for them to have different styles of play, but it's also okay for you to not like those styles of play. It did demonstrate, by the way, reading this stuff did demonstrate to me that it would have been a great time to play in the early 1970s, late 1970s, if I had the right group in that era. So if I ever get a time machine, hot tub or otherwise, to travel back in time, I'd like to do that. In particular, I'd like to game with the Southern California scene, having, when I lived in LA, shopped at Aero Hobbies and the Warhouse, I really would have liked to have seen those stores in their heyday when they had their vibrant gaming communities. Now, it sounds like I've been critical of Robin and his advice here, and I don't mean to be that way. Robin is, as I said, one of the two most important writers about how to game master that I've encountered in the entire hobby. He wrote what I think is one of my top 10 role-playing games of all time. It's a game called Feng Shui. It's based on Hong Kong action films, and it is an inspired work that has had a legacy of effects throughout gaming, and rightly so. You can see elements of it in 5th edition, and 4th edition, and 3rd edition, Dungeons & Dragons. You can see it in other games, including Two Little Mice's game Outgunned. There's just all kinds of influence from this game, and from Robin's writings in general. And I highly recommend reading Robin's article on page XX, and as I said, I'll provide a link to that below, or even better, you can read my Substack, which provides a link to it and has a lot of the same information that I'm talking about here, so you can share that with your friends as well. I do wish, however, that Robin had not focused merely on the murder hobo as a wrongdoer and looked at the issue more holistically. I know he didn't have all the space in the world, but here I've been able to talk through a bit of it, and hopefully this discussion will provoke you to think about the issue in other ways, and maybe you can provide me with even more information that I can add to my DM prep shelf and hard drive by commenting below. So if you have any thoughts on this, on what you would do in this situation where you have a disruptive player and what the potential causes of that disruption might be, please feel free to leave that in the comments below. I'm always happy to read comments. And I'll see you next week here on Geekarati. This geek of technology.
He's a Highlander, by God.
Strange game. The only winning mode is not to play.